Hello, my name is Steve Adolf, and welcome to our topic, Epic Stories and Product Management. Now, in a previous topic, we talked about how we could split large stories, which we refer to as epics, into smaller user stories, which we could implement in a single sprint or iteration. Now, let's see how we can use that technique as a product management strategy. One of the reasons we are interested in story splitting is to get stories ready for a sprint or iteration, because we can run into a lot of difficulties if we don't have good stories for our sprint. That means stories that will fit into our sprint, stories that we understand. And to be real clear here, I have been in a lot of very bad sprint planning meetings where stories have been presented where people did not understand them, there were disputes about them, they simply were not ready for that sprint, yet they were the highest priority of the product owner. This is how sprint planning can turn into something extremely difficult. Generally, my view is that planning should take only a couple of hours at most. And I've seen these turn into all-day affairs and more, and no one coming out very happy. So, how do we make sure that we have stories that are ready? And one of the criteria that we could use for understanding when is a story ready and how we can refine the backlog is the so-called INVEST criteria. Now, the INVEST is a lovely little acronym. People can say invest in good stories, for example. It's a lovely little acronym for saying what makes or what are the attributes we should be looking at in a story to ensure that it's ready. Well, one of the attributes is the I for independent. Now, what that means is, remember, our strategy or our intent behind user stories is to deliver a thin, valuable slice of behavior or functionality to our stakeholders such that they can evaluate it and give us feedback. Well, that means a user story must be independent of other user stories. For example, in here, we can see the blue story. It cannot be dependent on another story that's going to be implemented in a later sprint. Otherwise, we're simply not going to be able to deliver that in this sprint. So the idea is stories are independent. They can be developed and delivered in that single sprint and not have to be waiting on other stories to be delivered before we can show it off to our stakeholders and product owner. Negotiable. Remember, you may have recalled from earlier topics, we said basically when we refer to the so-called 3 C's, the user story is a conversation. Now, conversation is a dialogue, goes both ways. Simply not the product owner telling the team what needs to be done. It's an opportunity for the team to consult with the product owner and propose other ideas for its implementation. Valuable. The first thing you would think of, well, yeah, Steve, we're not going to do a user story that's not valuable. Well, remember, that's what part of the point of looking at Agile. We made an assertion in one of our earlier topics that a lot of the work that we're doing is not valuable. So we want to ensure that, yes, this user story is valuable to someone. Someone is taking an interest in this user story. So definitely, is the user story actually valuable? Is it delivering value to that stakeholder? Typically, this is where we're trying to avoid CRUD stories or component-based stories. We're still trying to get that thin end-to-end slice if we can, so we can show the end-to-end functionality to our stakeholder. The E here is really important to me. I think estimable is a really good criteria for determining if a story is ready. Simply, if the team can't put an estimate on that story, it means you don't know enough about the story to do that. That means there's major gaps in your knowledge about the story, and it's simply not ready to take into the sprint. Small or right-sized. We said earlier on that a user story can be implemented in a single sprint. So it needs to be small. That's the intent behind the user story in the first place. What I mean by right-sized is as the story is making its way through the backlog, yeah, it's appropriate for where it is in the stage of its life. But certainly small is a criteria that we want to have. And testable. Do we understand how to test this story, and can we come up with tests for this story? Again, these are really good ways, or the INVEST criteria is a really good criteria for looking at a story and saying, are we getting these stories ready? Are we going through the process of refining the backlog? And the story splitting is a way that we refine the backlog. We take those big stories that might not be small and start splitting them into smaller and smaller stories. Now, the key is through the splitting, we want to be able to get the resulting stories from that split closer and closer to this INVEST criteria. So some of the strategies that people might use to split a story, splitting a story by development phase or splitting a story by component, are not going to get the stories truly ready. What I would like to show you are 3 strategies for splitting stories that preserve value and help you get the stories to a right size for implementation. So I call these epic user story splitting strategies a model-driven strategy, where we use traditional software development models like use cases, state transition diagrams, flow diagrams, ERDs to help us split the stories in a valuable way. The acceptance criteria on the user stories is another great way of splitting a story into smaller, valuable stories. And finally, one that I refer to as high fidelity, low fidelity. Now, model-driven says if we have a user story here, that we can actually present a model that describes that user story. For example, I'm very much fond of use cases. Use cases are a modeling technique where we look at actors of the system, or users of the system if you like, and all the different ways that they can get value from the system. And so, for example, here for upgrade seat, we have a use case with an actor who's a traveler. We have a main success scenario that describes how the actor gets value from the system, and then we have several alternative scenarios. So the use case is an example of a model. Like I said, there's other models that you can use. There's ERDs or state transition diagrams. And we can use the information that we gain from that model to help us split the story. For example, as I mentioned, use cases are a collection of scenarios that describe how an actor of a system gets value from the system or gets a job done. So we could split this story up, or this use case, by its scenario. So that maybe one user story would be an implementation of the main success scenario. Another use case might be, or user story might be another, might be one of the alternatives, and so forth. You've also probably noticed sometimes I do mix up the terms user stories and use cases. They are distinctly different, just as an aside there. So you can see how we can actually start use this model here to come up with smaller use cases or user stories that have smaller scope than the original parent user story. Another technique is what I call acceptance criteria driven. Here, in the acceptance, you notice we have a user story. It's got 3 acceptance criteria. Each one of those acceptance criteria does capture something that's valuable to the end user. So we could look at a technique to perhaps defer implementation of some of these acceptance criteria into smaller user stories. So we can see here we can break out additional user stories. Finally, we have the low fidelity, high fidelity model. Now, this is based on an article that was published by Bill Wake a number of years ago, and it simply identified a number of techniques for reducing the cost of implementation or exploring techniques for incrementally delivering behavior. For example, you can see something very simple here that, let's say we have our interest, or what's important to our stakeholders is that the algorithm or system behaves. Maybe before we tack on a expensive user interface, we just test with the APIs. Now that's a technique I've used many times with a lot of clients, where the interest of the stakeholders is, do we get the answer that's important to us? So we simply build the functionality as an API. We have a test jacket that shows that yes, in fact, we got that behavior. And then we start incrementally adding on a fancy UI. Maybe first we start with a character or script UI, and then we add the custom UI. So you can see that, there's just a number of techniques in which we could split stories along using models, using the acceptance criteria, and having a low fidelity, high fidelity implementation.